The Other Side of the Sun by Madeleine L'Engle, 3-2. After breakfast, the old great aunts retired to the small writing room which opened off the south side of the living room. Aunt Irene went upstairs to put a cool cloth on her forehead. Uncle Hoadley inconspicuously removed himself. I went out to the kitchen to get permission to explore the house, before going up the beach to look for my shoes. Permission from Honoria and Clive? Yes, after all, it was Honoria's house. But when I got out to the kitchen, Willie and Harry and Dr. Ron James sat at the kitchen table eating cornbread and syrup. All 3 rows as I entered, and Willie handed me something wrapped in an old paisley scarf. I opened it. There were the shoes and stockings I had lost the night before. Thank you, Willie. I was going to have to go look for them this morning. Did I drop them when I was with you? No. Willie shook his head. Bad to let Zenimums get. Bad. Hurt, Harry warned. Willie put his arms around me, kissing me gently on the cheek. He smelled of tobacco and fish and the oil used for the insect repellent. It was not an unpleasant smell. We like you. Harry was immediately behind him. Want to kiss the pretty lady, too. Leave her alone. Ron's voice startled me with its Englishness. No, it's all right. We're friends. I met them last night on the beach. I turned my cheek to Harry. The twins were dressed this morning in faded blue trousers and what had once been red and white checked shirts, and could be told apart by their neckerchiefs. Willie's blue, Harry's red. Willie, Ron said, if I have 5 apples to sell at 5 cents each, and you buy 2, how much do you pay me? Willie bowed his head, unable to face disappointing Ron. Don't know. Too hard. Can't afford apples nohow, Harry said. Maybe if it was oranges, Ron suggested. Willie shook his head. Still too hard. Oranges, grapefruit, kumquat, still too hard. Can't do apples. I smiled, remembering when I was a small girl, my father was trying to teach me arithmetic. We, too, had our problems with apples. When he tried to teach me that nothing times something equals nothing, a simple mathematical fact, but totally incomprehensible to me, 0 times 3 equals 0, it was impossible to me as 5 apples at 5 cents to Willie and Harry. I actually succeeded in annoying my father, which wasn't easy with my obsessions. 0 times 3 equals 0 is a fact, he said. But father, take 3 apples. I can see that you have no apples, and you multiply them by 3. You still have no apples, but if you already have 3 apples, and you multiply them by nothing, that doesn't make them go away, does it? My father told me rather brusquely that he was trying to teach me mathematics, not metaphysics. But father, if it's true in metaphysics, it has to be true in mathematics, doesn't it? I never said it was true in metaphysics. But if you have 3 apples, Stella, for the time being, you will have to accept that 0 times 3 equals 0. The entire multiplication table is an agreed-upon fiction to make life more convenient, and you will have to bear with it. Odd, I couldn't. I never had any trouble with complicated equations. For instance, when we were studying astronomy, my father taught me to determine the distance between the Earth and the Moon by observing the size of the Earth's shadow on the Moon during a lunar eclipse, this being the method first suggested by Astatius of Samos around 250 BC, and this had not confused me in the least. Perhaps the difference between my understanding of mathematics and the twins was one of degree rather than kind. It took me a great deal of pain and fear before I learned that my father was right. After a while, he stopped trying to make me understand that 0 times 3 does indeed equal 0, because I'm sure he knew that only experience can teach the truth of that particular mathematical fact. It's not a pleasant rule, but it has to be accepted. You can have something, even if it's only 3 apples, and if you multiply them by nothing, still you don't have them anymore. But this was something I still had to learn, as I sat in the dappled sunlight in Honoria's big kitchen on my first day in Illyria. As though to make up for failing us over the price of apples, Willie pushed back his chair, smiled, and beckoning Harry following him, smiling and beckoning, Harry following him, and they went out onto the kitchen porch, bobbing, calling, "Come, pretty lady, come, Doc." Out on the veranda hung a straw basket. Sunflower seeds for the birds, Ron said, and wait. Willie reached into the basket and came out with a little green wiggly lizard, which he held on the gently curled palm of his hand. The lizard, interrupted from its morning nap, puffed up in fear like a little balloon, and Willie began to stroke it with a gentle finger, and I could see the little creature calming down, returning to its normal size. When it was completely relaxed and comfortable, lying in Willie's hand, it began to roll its eyes. "Loves us! Loves us!" Willie cried joyfully. Ron said, "I read once in a scientific textbook that when a lizard wants to express affection, it rolls its eyes, but I've never seen it happen except with Willie and Harry." Willie held his hand toward me. "Pretty lady!" This was both gift and test. I held out my hand, and the lizard was slid onto my palm. For a moment it puffed up, then as I took my finger and stroked it as Willie had done, it shrank again. Its tiny claws tickled my palm as it wriggled slightly. It felt cool, the way jade does, no matter what the weather. I looked down on the little thing, tender, green, with jeweled eyes, beautiful and innocent, and laughed slightly with the pleasure of this new experience. "Oh, thank you, Willie," I returned the delicate little creature. Willie slid it back into the hanging basket and beckoned again, tiptoeing around the veranda to a great brass pot which contained a geranium plant, the most enormous and luxuriant geranium plant I had ever seen. Curled up around the plant was a little green snake. "Shh!" Willie held one finger to his lips. "Sleeping. Nice dreams," Harry whispered. "Oh, pretty, pretty." Ron spoke reassuringly to me. "It's just a garden snake, Mrs. Rainier, and the geranium pot is its favorite bed, and of course, when there are snakes, there's never any problem with rats." The little snake curled around the plant. It reminded me of the snakes on my ring. The twins either caught my thought or had it too. Willie put out an exploratory finger to touch the ring, then he smiled up at me. "Love!" Harry too touched the ring. "Strong!" "Not soft," Willie said. "Stern, just, always." He turned away, skipping across the worn boards of the veranda. "Hungry!" Harry clapped his hands. "Hungry!" I followed them back to the kitchen. Harry sang in his rusty voice. "Oranges and lemons, say the bells of St. Clement's. Honoria, ma'am, please." He held out his plate. "A little cornbread to finish my syrup." Willie held out his plate. "A little syrup to finish my cornbread. When will you pay me, say the bells of Old Bailey." Harry, wiping cornbread and syrup around on his plate, said, "When I grow rich, say the bells of Shoreditch." And Willie, a fork in his mouth, "Here comes the candle to light you to bed. Here comes a chopper to chop off your head." Harry spoke through a mouthful. "Glad the pretty lady's come. Stop the chopper." "Glad, glad," Willie said. He reached his hand toward mine and gently touched my ring. "Good lady." I took my shoes and stockings up to my room and put them away, wondering where the twins had found them. I stood out on the back veranda. A redbird sat in the chinaberry tree and screamed at me. Minu, the kitten, came pouncing around the corner and spat at the redbird, who flew off. I started down the back steps when Minu twined herself around my ankles, then swished down the steps, tail erect and quivering, looking back over his shoulder, as much as to say, "Come along, I have something to show you." I followed him down the path of old pale pink bricks set in a zigzag pattern. At the foot of the kitchen garden was a windbreak of bamboo, and just in front of this was an ancient fig tree, old and gnarled, many of its branches bare of leaves. One branch alone was fresh and green and heavy with fruit. Manu sat down under it, curled his tail about himself, and began washing his face. The sun beat down on my head. I turned back to the house and exploration. Throughout Illyria was the smell of sea, of mustiness, almost a fungoid smell. The rolling of the breakers surrounded the walls of Illyria, so that it was as though I were walking within an enormous conch shell, winding my way from chamber to chamber. And birds, seagulls screamed, and again I heard the mockingbird's pure and underacid song, surrounding it in a constant chittering of birds I could not identify. The wind rattled in the palms, loose shutters clattered. Downstairs, the main body of Illyria consisted of the two big rooms, living and dining. Adjoining these was a small writing room and Aunt Olivia's room. I peeped in the half-open door to see an enormous mahogany four-poster bed with dotted Swiss summer curtains. There was a massive mahogany bureau and a highboy even larger and in poorer repair than the one in my room. A large mahogany rocking chair, a dressing table, a wardrobe with a speckled mirror. Everything was massive, dark, too heavy for the tiny, delicate old lady who would be lost in that huge bed. On the walls were seascapes of storms, dark, still lives. I moved on to look in the other major ground floor room. The library, a square room, the walls covered with books piled on tables on the floor. I choked over the smell of leather mold and paper dust. A portrait hung over the mantelpiece. A young brown-haired woman, elegantly dressed. It must be the portrait of Mado, which Clive had told me about. Mado holding a flute so that it did not quite touch her lips. Lips puckered slightly, as though for a kiss, rather than as though she were about to play. The eyes were blue, a darker blue than Aunt Olivia's. They were, in fact, very much the same color as mine, and yes, they did look expectant, as though she were watching a sunrise. "Oh, you're lovely," I said to her, "and someone should take care of these books or they'll all fall apart." I sneezed. Rubbing my nose, I leaned against a section of bookcase and was startled to have it swivel around under my weight to reveal a large, beautifully proportioned ballroom. Spiderwebs threaded delicately through the prisms of the chandelier and bound a few rickety gilt chairs against the wall. Long windows looking out to sea led onto a kind of promenade. I pushed at one of the windows, but damp had stuck them tight. The promenade, I realized, was where Uncle Hoadley had been pacing the night before. I moved through the ballroom and out the far door, climbed a rush-carpeted staircase, and went down a long hall with rooms on either side. Most of the rooms were at least sparsely furnished. Some had matting on the floors, others threadbare Persian or Chinese rugs. The walls all had paintings, seascapes, still lives, a series of faded prints of native flowers, or at least I assumed them to be native, and everywhere were portraits looking at me with following eyes, accusing, wistful, occasionally sinister, but usually welcoming eyes. Hello, newest Mrs. Thornton, Mrs. Theron Rainier. Wear of the ring, we are your family, you belong to us. And you to me, I extended my welcome in return. One day you will hang on our walls, terrors of mine, and I will say to the children, this is your Aunt Olivia, this is your cousin James. Terry had promised me that Illyria was a joyful house. I stood still, sniffing, sensing it was, I thought, a waiting house. There was a feeling of expectancy about the rooms. There was, I thought suddenly, a demand of me. I did not want it. I turned away. Terry had talked to me about the comfortable pleasure of sitting in the kitchen with Honoria and Clive, drinking milk and eating cookies. And then, when he was older, tea and coffee. That's what I would do, I decided. Needing a comfortableness, I would go find Honoria and Clive. It took me a few minutes to realize that I was lost. I had run down a flight of stairs thinking to find the kitchen, but the rooms it led me to made a separate wing to the south of the main house. I found another flight of stairs. This led me to what I took to be the north wing, mostly bedrooms with tables and chests which looked as though they had been brought from China, some definitely Chinese vases, and then a glass case full of porcelain horses, which I was sure must be infinitely valuable. I went up the stairs to the third floor, the floor I shared with Honoria and Clive. I was perhaps not far from my own bedroom, but the wings of the house did not seem to connect up on the third floor, and I could see no way to get from this cul-de-sac to the part of the house with which I was familiar. There was only an iron ladder leading to a skylight almost obscured by cobwebs. I was not quite frightened. If I did not feel the joy which my husband had led me to expect in Illyria, at least I felt no threat, no evil, only the waiting, the expectancy. I opened a door with a china white handle. But here was a room which was used. The walls were covered with maps in which red and green flagged pins were stuck. A large table in the center of the room served as a desk and was piled with papers. Spread out on the desk was some kind of plan. This was a war room. I had a sudden anxiety that someone would come in and see me where I had no business to be. The war room did not want me. I was an intruder. I backed out, rushing away before I was caught. I ran down the stairs, pushed open the door on the next floor, which would be directly beneath the war room, ran through it, a pretty and peaceful bedroom with French furniture, found a flight of stairs, ran down them, and half fell into the library, knocking over a pile of books in a cloud of dust. There was nobody in the kitchen, only the heat, filtering through the shutters, moving sluggishly in the breeze. I wanted Honoria and Clive. I ran upstairs, the familiar stairs, to the third floor, past my room, knocking at closed doors and opening them to find a bedroom, then a big box room. There were my emptied trunks, another bedroom, and finally Honoria and Clive. They were standing facing each other across an old iron bedstead with sagging springs. I was embarrassed and apologetic over having blundered in on them this way. But they welcomed me, turning from each other to the door and saying, "Come in, Miss Stella." I entered awkwardly. Theirs was a big and airy room, sparsely furnished but full of wind and light. Besides the bed, there were two old and comfortable but extremely shabby chairs, evidently retired from the main house, one on either side of a rosewood table. In one corner, above a large chest of drawers, was a mirror framed in seashells. Clive looked at it affectionately. "Jimmy made that for us one Christmas, with a lot of help from Thero, of course." Clive and Honoria and Clive, keep Illyria's light alive. They had a son whose name was Jim. "Your son?" Clive said very quietly. "Yes, Jimmy was born here at Illyria." Beneath the mirror was a framed daguerreotype, browned and speckled with age and sea damp, a picture of 7 boys ranging from age 15 or 16 down to a toddler, a little black boy with great innocent eyes and a winsome, wistful smile, sitting on the lap of the eldest boy, the boy I recognized as Thero, blond and stocky and cocksure, and a baby, a tiny black button, held by a tall, thin boy I was sure was Uncle Hoadley. "That was the children the way we was then," Clive said. "Thero, Mr. Hoadley, the twins, Jamie, Jimmy, and Anna." "Jamie and Anna?" I asked. Honoria answered with a quiet and stark acceptance I did not understand. "Jamie was Miss Maddo's youngest. Anna, Clive's, and my baby. They died of scarlet fever the next spring after the picture was taken. All the children took it. The others pulled through, with long nursing. It were a killing fever that year. It be good we have the picture. Miss Mado had it made for us." It was a charming picture. All the children were handsome and appealing, with the fey expression of the twins already their full size, already gnomish, shorter than Thero and Uncle Hoadley. Odd, I thought of my husband's father as Thero, but Uncle Hoadley, even as a slight, rather melancholy-looking young boy, I still thought of as Uncle Hoadley. Jimmy was the kind of wide-eyed, wistful child people would immediately want to pick up and cuddle. It was difficult for me to imagine him a grown man, the father of Dr. Ron James. Holding the picture, I said, Jimmy, he's sitting on Pharaoh's lap. Yes, Miss Stella, Clive answered. Mr. Pharaoh's shadow, we called him. Pharaoh was very patient with Jimmy. He was good with the twins, too. They was about his age, but acted more like Jimmy, and Pharaoh would spend hours with them, teaching them to swim, going crabbing, or digging for clams. He spoke slowly, carefully. It seemed as though he were deliberately trying to find kind things to say about my husband's father. Or Donnox. You ever had Donnox soup, Miss Stella? No. What's Donnox? Next time you walk down the beach, look for little bubbles in the sand. That means Donnox. You can just dig with your hand into the sand and pick them up. Little shellfish no bigger than your fingernail, all pinks and blues and lavenders. Honoria, you make Miss Stella some Donnox soup soon, hear? I'll do that, Honoria said, but they were not thinking about Donnox. Jimmy, I said again, then stopped. James said on James, Clive said. He paused then. You see, Miss Stella, slaves didn't have no names except in what their masters give them. No names? No names of their own? Like a horse or a dog, Miss Stella. He was stating a fact. But that's not the way it was at Nyssa. I was born at Nyssa. I always knowed who I am. I grew up always knowing Mr. James and Mr. Theron. When a slave was freed by his master, if, Honoria said, not many were, he had to have a name, and often he would take the name of the man who freed him, sometimes out of honor, sometimes because it was easiest. When my mother had me baptized, she gave me the name of James, Clive James, after Mr. James, and I always been proud to bear it, and give it to my sons. Mr. James, the best man I ever knowed. Mr. James and Mr. Theron, and the best friends to me. And to each other. Rainier men understand friendship, or used to, Honoria said. Clive turned to her. Mr. Hoadley loved Mr. Therow, that a fact. I asked, and Jimmy and Therow were friends? Clive said slowly, Our Jimmy was many years younger than Mr. Therow and Mr. Hoadley. It's all right when they still boys, but when they grow to be young men, they moved into different worlds. Did they? Honoria asked. Her voice was deep, harsh. She looked at Clive, as she had been looking at him when I came into the room. In the nature of things, Clive said gently. Honoria was not gentle. The black world and the white world. But there was a shadow world that overlaps. In Honoria, who had never been a slave, I sensed a smoldering anger. To try to ease the tension, I said, I met Jimmy's wife last night. It was as though my innocent statement had turned me into Medusa and Clive and Honoria to stone. For a long, frightened moment, I had no idea what I had said or done. I thought they would never move or speak to me again. Then Clive sat down on the edge of the bed, the creak of rusty springs loud as thunder. In the silence, took a Bible from the bed table and turned it in his dark fingers as though seeking strength. Honoria rose. She towered over me. She seemed to have grown taller, as she had with Uncle Hoadley on the veranda. Where you hear about Jimmy and Belle Zinneman? I didn't. I met Belle last night when I went for my walk on the beach. What'd she say? I don't. She was very kind to me, very friendly. Where'd she take you? I looked from Honoria's stern face to Clive, still turning the Bible in his hands. He saw my consternation. Honoria, be gentle with Miss Stella. She don't know. Honoria repeated her question, but her voice was less guttural and strange. Where'd she take you? I answered reluctantly. We went back behind the dunes to the creek. Who was there? Belle's grandmother, she... Oh, Honoria, she frightened me. Miss Stella, when you went on your walk last night, tell me. Tell me everybody you see. Well, I saw Ron first, and then I walked on farther, and I saw the twins, and then Belle and her grandmother. Everything was all right except the grandam, and I don't know why she frightened me so. She just... I wanted Honoria to reassure me, to comfort me as she had comforted Aunt Olivia during the storm the night before, but she turned to Clive. It's the rule of three. Ron, the twins, the Zinneman. 1 is not chance, 2 is not coincidence, but 3 mean. She sat down, withdrawing herself, holding her arms about herself and rocking slightly back and forth. Again, she spoke only to Clive. I told you what I saw. I told you. It will happen again. We cannot prevent it. And I am too old now. I cannot carry enough pain. It will be unbearable. Honoria. Clive put the Bible back on the table. Miss Stella, it is not good that you should go near the Zinneman. God, Honoria said. Oh, my Lord. I could not reach out to touch Honoria. She had gone to some cold, dark place beyond human comfort. Clive was not offering her comfort. He was, in a strange sense, giving judgment. Honoria rose ponderously. For a moment she stood silent, motionless, while strength and dignity returned to her. Better go downstairs now, Miss Stella. I was not being dismissed because of what I had said or done. I did not know what it was, only that I had brought an agony almost too great to be borne. I followed them down to the kitchen, feeling shaky and strangely chilled. The kitchen was empty. The old enamel coffee pot was still on the back of the stove, and Honoria poured me a cup of the cold and muddy brew, then went to the old stove sink and began washing rice in a colander. Clive sat down across from me at the table and continued with his work of polishing silver. Sulphur water blackened the silver. Have to keep at it every day. Ain't never done. The outer door slammed and Ron came into the kitchen. He spoke to me courteously and asked if I had been enjoying the morning. Yes, thank you. I looked round the big kitchen. The back veranda deflected some of the fierceness of the sun's rage, and light shifted through the vines in shifting, dappled patterns. On the worn floor, the wooden shutters let in whisperings of breeze. Finbar lay snoring lightly under the large black range, which was used only in winter. I've been exploring the house, I said, and waited. There was a small pause, then Honoria spoke calmly without apology. Most of the house, excepting the main building, is pretty dusty. I gazed at the unappetizing dregs in my coffee cup, asking after the fact. Is there any place I oughtn't to go? Ron James gave a small smile. Like Bluebeard's wife? Most southern families, Honoria amended, have skeletons in cupboards. The doctor's smile had been turned inwards, not towards anybody, but I directed my smile straight to him. And a closet full of Bluebeard's dead wives? You should have asked your husband that, not me. Theron! Honoria swung round from the stove. You go anywhere you like, Miss Stella. We even got a secret room in Illyria if you can find it. Mr. Claudius Broadley thought he might have to hide me out. Don't you pay no mind to Ronnie's humor. It's ugly, ugly. Somebody threw a flaming brand at the twins' house last night, Grandmother. They were struggling to put it out when the storm broke and doused it for them before any real damage was done. Why the twins? Why anybody? Ron countered. Was it because of you? Honoria asked him. Who knows? The back stoop was burned off. But that was all, this time. He turned to leave. Clive asked, Where you going, son? There's a fever in one of the clearings back of the scrub. They asked me to come. What kind of fever? Probably typhoid. Don't worry, grandfather. I won't bring anything back to Illyria. When you be home. By this evening. When he had gone, I said, Honoria, when I was in the library, I leaned against some books and they moved. Yes, there be a revolving door leading to the dancing room. I went in. It's a lovely room. Don't know what Mr. Claudius Broadley had in mind when he built him a room like that. But we used to have dances there after the war. Not balls like in Jefferson, but Virginia reels, and all the young people laughing and everybody able to forget for a while. Miss Mado, she danced like a butterfly even when she an old lady. There's been some happy times in Illyria, Miss Stella. Your great aunts was asking for you. They in the writing room. And that is the end of the second chapter.